Okay, so it is now recording. Brilliant. So I'm Dr. Penny Bradshaw. I'm an Associate Professor of English Literature at the University of Cumbria. And I organised these events as part of my role as theme lead for cultural landscapes within our Centre for National Parks and Protected Areas. So this is the May event in our Cultural Landscapes monthly series. And it is my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker for the May event, Laura Day. So Laura is currently in the final stages, the very exciting final stages, hopefully, of completing a PhD at Durham University on the poetry of Norman Nicholson, examined through an eco-critical and environmental lens. Laura grew up on and still lives on a hill farm in eastern Cumbria, and she serves as youth representative on the Norman Nicholson Society Committee, which is a wonderful role. And she also holds a similar position on the Yorkshire Dales National Park Management Plan Steering Group. Both really worthwhile, important contributions. I'm sure everyone in the audience will agree to those two organisations and bodies. So I'm sure you'd like to join with me in offering a virtual welcome to Laura. I'll do that myself as we're on Teams. So I'm now going to hand you over to her. Thank you very much, Laura.
Thank you. I'm just checking, Penny, can you and everyone else hear me?
Yes, perfect. And the slides are clear. Good.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay, so thank you to the University of Cumbria and to Penny for inviting me to give this lecture online today. This talk is actually adapted from a paper I have just had published with the Durham University Postgraduate English Journal, and it addresses Norman Nicholson's 1954 poetry collection entitled The Pot Geranium. Throughout the presentation, there will be key quotes from my paper on the slides on your screen, so you can read them whilst I'm talking about them and sort of keep them in your mind a little bit. I should mention that the photo actually that I've used on my slides is one that I took. The location is on descent from Hartefell, the northern Hartefell, up at Haweswater in the Eastern Lake District near where I'm from. And it was taken one very cold November morning, moments after I experienced a cloud inversion, hence all the clouds sort of in between the hills. So Norman Nicholson was a poet and born in 1914 in Millom, which is in South Cumbria, and he died in 1987. He lived his entire life in the town of Millom on St George's Terrace, which is right in the centre, except for a few years spent in a sanatorium down south owing to ill health as a young man. His poetry spans many decades, and he also wrote prose works and edited a collection as well. He also wrote journalistic works for the Church Times, and all of his prose and his poetry addressed the county of Cumbria mostly, known back in that time as Cumberland and Westmoreland, and addressed also specifically the landscapes that he experienced as a lifelong resident of the county. His writing is continually championed by the hard work of the Norman Nicholson Society, which Penny mentioned earlier, and of which I am a member. In his poetry, Norman Nicholson makes a case for the boundaries of defined and familial spaces. His boundary of choice is the southern stretch of land between the Lake District National Park and the Irish Sea. His life was once characterised by living on the edge of the national park, even though some of his life passed in the period before the designation of the park in 1951, and his wider poetry reflects a state of liminality in his thinking as a result. Arguably, the main boundary and space-based tensions in Nicholson's collection arise in the relationship between the town of Millom and the ironworks site that were built on the periphery of the town, next to the Duddon estuary in the 19th century. David Boyd writes of the ironworks and the related industry, and this is the quote on the screen: "The iron ore mines and the ironworks were the very reason for the town and the community coming into being, and they had formed its lifeblood for the past century. Therefore, it's easy to suggest that the presence of the ironworks was truly fundamental to the fabric of life in the town of Millom, and still holds an important role in the history of the community today." So in his 1963 article entitled The Second Chance, which was published in The Listener, Norman Nicholson describes his hometown of Millom as a town with a jagged edge. There were wedges of wasteland driven hard between the houses. His description of jagged suggests that the boundary was raw and a work in progress, a harsh reality for those living in the small mining community. This boundary defines the Millom and South Cumberland landscape for Nicholson, as well as his personal emotional interaction with the space that he labels as home. The ironworks permeate his home life intensely, and the pot geranium collection displays the hallmarks of a life lived in the shadow of dominant industry. The boundary between the ironworks and the town of Millom also speaks to wider tensions that Nicholson draws upon in his poetry. The poet acutely explores the relationship between man and the landscape in his works, oftentimes choosing to show man as exploitative and somewhat violent towards the natural space. Andrew Gibson terms the area Nicholson writes about as the Atlantic Edge, and argues that the space fairly comprehensively determines the character of Nicholson's vision and the substance of what he has to say. Gibson also notes that Nicholson is unwilling to look outwards, and thus I would suggest that the boundaries Nicholson creates in his poetry between Millom and the ironworks not only prohibit his interaction with what is beyond the realms of the town and the wider area, but also work hard to keep his gaze inward to such a specific strip of the British landscape, toward the edges prevalent on the outskirts of Millom town. The collection, perhaps oddly, contains a series of poems best termed as otherworldly. The poems take the reader and the poet away from the familiarity of Millom and serve to demonstrate Nicholson's mode of thinking. For the poet, he is either intensely focused on his hometown, or he is otherwise dreaming of otherworldly spheres. The poems, including The Unseen Centre, The Undiscovered Planet, and The Expanding Universe, serve to widen the perspective of the reader, who is invited to think cosmically about man's place in the world, which perhaps links to Nicholson's wider environmental concerns. In a short poem entitled The Unseen Centre, the reader is asked to consider the moon personified, which, and this is the first quote, never sees the world round which she circles backward. As the poem closes, Nicholson maps the moon's experience onto the human experience, commenting that perhaps humans do not know the unseen centre round which our bodies go. This poem demonstrates Nicholson's intensity of feeling over mankind's possible ignorance of nature and his place in it. Despite the poem's stated focus on the moon, his redirection of the reader's attention to the centres of their own orbits underlines the significance of specific physical space in his poetics. Today, what remains of Millom's ironworks amounts to a nature reserve on the very edge of town, which people can freely visit and walk around. Whilst there is no fanfare at the site about this key part of Millom's history, Nicholson frequently addressed the importance of the ironworks in the lives of the people of Millom town. When the ironworks closed in 1968, Nicholson commented in his prose work Greater Lakeland that 100 years of continuous production of iron has suddenly come to a stop. Reporters, television cameramen, and others flocked to the town like sightseers at an accident, and the picture they gave to the public was one of a dying town on the edge of nowhere, full of disconsolate people trudging along streets of decaying terraced houses. Nicholson wrote of how the dying town of Millom reflected how the ironworks site was responsible for the community's existence, and that the townspeople were somewhat lost with its closure. Just metres away from the ironworks, down Devonshire Road, the houses of Millom began, with little separating the ironworks from the homes of its former workers. The boundary between the two spaces is blurred, perhaps denoting the close connection between work and home life that was present when the ironworks were running in the 19th and 20th centuries. This boundary also speaks to the immense influence of the ironworks and of the rock underlying the landscape in the fabric appearance of the town itself. Indeed, of the closure of the ironworks in 1968, David Boyd notes, the ironworks closure thus had obvious implications for all kinds of immense human suffering to the unfortunate former blast furnacemen, all of their dependents, and ultimately for the whole town. Millom, in essence, was a town bound by its ironworks and associated quarries. Norman Nicholson seldom left Millom in what is now southern Cumbria. He spent his life in a terraced house in the town centre, which shaped his perspective on his immediate landscape significantly. Black Combe looms large over Millom to the north, and the town is hemmed in to the south and the west by the Irish Sea. To the far north lie the mountains and lakes of the Lake District, and Millom itself is segregated from much of the rest of southern Cumbria to the east by the Duddon estuary. In Nicholson's time, there was only a single road leading down to this secluded section of Cumbrian coastline, and even today, access to the area surrounding Millom requires a decently long journey from other parts of the county. In his prose, Greater Lakeland, published in 1969, Nicholson wrote of Millom, yet, even in its isolation, Millom is quite typical of Greater Lakeland as a whole, for the area has always been physically detached from the rest of Britain. As such, Millom's geographical location places it on several boundaries. The parameters of the boundaries, particularly that between his home in the town and the ironworks on the outskirts of Millom, identified in Nicholson's work, are constantly in flux and creates a sense of instability and lack of self-definition in the poet's writings too. His poetry creates a harsh beauty in the area, which is juxtaposed against the antecedent writings of William Wordsworth and his colleagues, who focused mainly on the idyllic nature of the central lakeland space in the north. Nicholson's lifetime of work demonstrates a growing sentiment for his home place, though, given that both his prose and poetry focus on a life lived in and around Millom. Nicholson's life, as I have mentioned, was spent in the town, save for a short spell down south in a sanatorium, and so he likely developed sentiment for the place due to its role in forming his identity as a child and then into adulthood. In his autobiography, published in 1975, entitled Wednesday Early Closing, the poet writes that, "I thought of myself as a Millom boy, not as a Cumbrian." Here, Nicholson demonstrates a self-definition that is centred on a particular small mining town, not the wider county. The poems of the Pot Geranium collection seem conflicted in their author's feeling for the space and for the ironworks themselves. Nicholson displays his inner conflict by blurring the boundaries between the town and the ironworks, creating a sense of community as having sprung from the landscape, and finding within his home the characteristics of sentimental attachment to space that any reader could relate to in their own home landscape, whilst also demonstrating a level of uncertainty toward the industry that has defined his. The poet also creates human images from static objects and scenes in the landscape, and frequently uses the images of children to emphasise his sentiment for, as well as the emotional turmoil of, the space. This ambivalence towards the ironworks is indicative of fundamental characteristic of Nicholson's work, by which he could be considered an environmentally prophetic poet. Starting with his earlier poetry of the 1940s, particularly the Rockface collection of 1948, the poet established a strong environmental concern, oftentimes giving voice to what he saw as the voicelessness of nature and the landscape. In the Pot Geranium collection, this prophetic tone reads as a deep concern for society's environmental future, and is particularly poignant when read considering 21st century anxieties surrounding the developments of climate change. The Pot Geranium collection overall is bound by the Millom landscape. The poems explore Nicholson's conflict in sentiment between his hometown and the ironworks, demonstrating his fear but also his subtle respect for the industry that economically supported the town that he lived his entire life in. He centres himself on the town and, as remarked by Andrew Gibson, is unwilling to look beyond the remit of the town boundaries, aside from the few otherworldly poetic inclusions of the collection, which themselves underline the significance of centering oneself on a particular physical locality. Nicholson's locality, then, is the immediate Millom and Hodbarrow landscape. The collection is foreshadowed by the narrative of Nicholson's titular poem, The Pot Geranium. The potted geranium, the flower, is a metaphor for Nicholson himself, and the familiar image of the poet in his tiny top-floor bedroom is introduced with the following lines. I turn from the window, letting the bobbins of autumn wind up the swallows, and lie on my bed. The poet appears confined to a space, unable to move beyond it. Kathleen Jones writes of the titular poem and the wider collection in her 2013 biography of Nicholson entitled The Whispering Poet, and she writes that he had spent his whole life in the small attic room he had occupied since he came back from Linford Sanatorium, an indoor plant, like the geranium. The potted geranium is also a metaphor for how Nicholson perhaps believes man must approach nature, that is, with care and compassion. The plant is cared for by the poet, nurtured through growth. This image suggests themes that become prominent as the collection continues, particularly that the need to care for nature is key rather than destroying it. As Jones also writes, the poem is a personal testimony of Nicholson's, and he takes care to construct the boundaries of his existence as the town of Millom in the opening lines. The poet begins the text with a detailed journey of the eye along the features of the town he sees from his bedroom window. The reader is taken through the streets of Millom from gable ends to the town's flagpole before Nicholson abruptly turns away from the scene. Whilst the ironworks are not mentioned at all in this poem, the narrative is an important foreshadowing of the remainder of the collection, in the way that the poet is bound to Millom and unlikely to leave. His room in St. George's Terrace is one of boundaries. In the poem, he likens the small space to a tent, with the medicalised white walls engulfing him as he lies on the bed. He is tightly bound to his mattress, and he cannot move, and then the reader is introduced to the image of the geranium, and therefore the image of Nicholson himself. The poet draws on William Cowper here, of whom Nicholson wrote a biography in 1951. Similar to Nicholson, Cowper lived a solitary life and was aware of the boundaries of the space he lived in. Nicholson writes of Cowper's work, life, on the whole, was a sad one, yet his poetry is largely the poetry of pleasure. There is often an underflow of melancholy. This view seems familiar as we read Nicholson's own pot geranium collection. Winter beckons in the titular poem of his collection, and Nicholson's relationship with the town and the ironworks is governed by an existence lived in his bedroom in a small house on St. George's Terrace. He ends the poem with a now familiar sentiment that underscores the entire collection. That is, he is confined as a limpet to one small radius of rock. As he goes on to do throughout the collection, Nicholson grounds his narrative and thinking in the presence of the rock, demonstrating his attention to environmental detail. The important symbol of the rock anchors the reader's understanding of the stripped and exploited earth, appearing as shorthand for man's negative impact on his environment and landscape. Furthermore, the image of confinement at the end of the pot geranium also indicates the poet's awareness of the boundaries within his own life and how they affect his interaction with the world outside. He suggests that he is isolated and alone, mirroring his descriptions of Millom as being on the edge of Cumbria, on the edge of mainland Britain and the Irish Sea. In another poem of the collection, entitled Winter by the Ironworks, Nicholson works to break down the boundary between Millom Ironworks and the town itself. He juxtaposes the innocence of children playing on the slag heaps with the almost monstrous presence of an industrial stronghold. The children are depicted as perhaps being on the edge of danger, given that the industrial remains in the slag heap are described as breaking wire and willow, choking gully and grid. Nicholson uses this description to map the image of choking onto the innocence of the children, and so despite their enjoyment of the slag heaps, they are on the boundary between the safety of home and the danger of the ironworks in the distance. Nicholson takes care to emphasise the children's throats, as just one line later he writes that they are smoking with dialect. The images of smoking and the earlier choking forge a clear connection here, but Nicholson also offers a further definition of home with his reference to the dialect. The poet opens Winter by the Ironworks with the apparent fragility of the industry. He describes the slag banks as seeming permanent also at line 3. In seeming permanent, the poet is suggesting that the image is not as it appears and implies that the snow and the ironworks are impermanent, much like the slag heaps. Nicholson also likens the slag heap dust to snowflakes, suggesting impermanence and instability of the children's surroundings. He writes in the poem, "Slowly, slag flake and fall, slither and crumble over back garden fences." Whilst the slag heaps are the fabric of the space they call home, there is a sense that it might all end once the industrial era closes, and the source of their fun and enjoyment, the heaps, will disappear in much the same way as the snow will. The fragility and impermanence of the snow in the ironworks is destabilising for the reader. With the implication that the snow and industry will not last, the reader is left to wonder what is next for the town and also for the children. The image of the children heightens the emotional turbulence in the poem because it not only draws on an image of innocence, but it also plays with the prospects of Millom. If the children are to represent the next generation of the town and the ironworks disappear much like the snow, one is forced to question what is left for them. This speaks to the larger environmental concerns that underscore the collection. Nicholson is beginning to question what will be left for man in the area once he exploits the natural resources available to him. There is a sense in the opening of Winter by the Ironworks of the malignant presence of the industrial site just a mile or so away. Under the guise of the snow, the slag banks move softly and slither through the properties of the town. The movement is a sneaky one, and the word slither recalls the snake in the Garden of Eden, and it should be mentioned here that Nicholson himself was religious. The poet is suggesting that despite the prosperity the ironworks bring to the town, the site is also a blot on the local landscape. This moment demonstrates his inner conflict of sentiment. Whilst Nicholson appreciates the presence of the ironworks as fundamental to the space that he inhabits, he also recognises the shortcomings of having such an industry on the doorstep. David Boyd writes of the ironworks, which sprung up in Millom and nearby Askham, and their decline. Not long after the worldwide adoption of the Bessemer process, further developments in steelmaking production technology, along with cheaper foreign imports, had slowly but inexorably been shrinking Millom's traditional market for low phosphorus hematite iron. This decline of industry frames Nicholson's ambivalence toward the ironworks, and representations of the site in his poetry is defined by the waste it leaves behind, thus indicating the exploitative nature of man's work on the landscape. As the poem Winter by the Ironworks comes to a close, Nicholson writes of the slag banks floating away in the whoosh of the wind, demonstrating the ease of dispersion of the ironworks' influence on the town of Millom and the wider South Cumbrian area. The poet also implies in Winter by the Ironworks the waste from the site is uncontrolled and infects the wider landscape without regulation. This is a perceptive understanding by Nicholson of the threat to the environment from heavy industry. Conversely, the poem comments culturally and socially on the importance of industry in the area, and, considering the ironworks shut in 1968, Nicholson is perhaps foreshadowing the emotional turmoil that would come when the industry was eventually dismantled for good. Images of winter, very much like Winter by the Ironworks, are present in two other poems of the Pot Geranium collection, and they blur the boundaries between the ironworks and the town of Millom too. The comparatively short Weather Ear poem opens the first three-line stanza with mention of the poet laid in bed, able to hear the bray of the furnace hooter. The setting is winter once more, and the poet acknowledges that if he can hear the furnace hooter from bed, the wind will travel from the east and the weather will be cold. He emphasises the association between the darkness and coldness of winter with the ironworks, bringing forth once more a sense of the negative influence of the ironworks site in Nicholson's life, particularly that of his childhood. In his autobiography, Wednesday Early Closing, Nicholson describes that as a child, we could walk down Devonshire Road to the ironworks, with its great funnels and furnaces, smoking and blaring, like a battleship aground on the tidal banks of the Duddon. The town lived perpetually in the groan and the hum of the furnaces. The image of the rock comes into play here in the closing of Weather Ear. No wind at all, and the street stone deaf with a cold in the head. The link here is made between the stone and the body, the reference to deafness and the head particularly, and this personifies the rock beneath the county and suggests that it is suffering, thereby denoting the exploitative nature of the ironworks and associated industry. Similarly, in the poem The Buzzer, the poet wakes on an evening in winter to hear the Paleolithic roar of the foundry buzzer in the distance. In both The Buzzer and Weather Ear, the poet is at home in the town, but the ironworks are ever present in his waking hours. He is in bed, arguably a place of safety, but also a place of vulnerability. The setting echoes that of the titular poem, The Pot Geranium. He cannot rest because of the domineering presence of the ironworks on the edge of the town, which appear close to him even though his home on St. George's Terrace is a mile or so away. The image of Nicholson as a child waking to the sound of the ironworks is torturous. He is kept awake by the near perpetual activity of the site. Further to this, the poems withdraw the use of sight, the sense of sight, from Nicholson as he lies in bed in the darkness, so he can only experience the ironworks through sound. The sound appears to be one that surrounds him and is more oppressive than the mere sight of the factory. The sound bleeds beyond the physical boundaries of the ironworks and further blurs the line between the town and its industry. The buzzer and weather ear both take place on a winter's night. As such, the poet underscores the ironworks throughout the Pot Geranium with associations of winter, darkness, and the cold. This association is not a pleasant one and suggests that Nicholson's relationship with the ironworks site was not one of fondness, but was instead one of potential entrapment and fear. The images of winter and the darkness also enclose the narrative into the small space of Nicholson's terrace house top floor bedroom. He is confined to the space, yet the presence of the ironworks filters through the darkness toward him. There is a sense of being trapped by the industry, speaking more widely to the reliance on the ironworks by the community for economic, social, and cultural security. Nicholson himself never worked at the ironworks, but he did have family members who worked there during their lifetimes. His connection to the site was familial in this sense, but his poetry does not offer delight in his relationship to the industry in any way, shape, or form. Again, in much the same way as the ironworks and the slag heaps were a malignant presence for the children in Winter by the Ironworks, Nicholson draws on the same image in The Buzzer. He writes of hearing the sound in the nights of his childhood before bringing the reader to the present day, suggesting that the fear ignited by the sound as a child has persisted into adulthood. He writes, "That buzzer, heard in boyhood, meant that nerves had sticker-rogered through a sleepless night." The emotionally triggering sound of the buzzer is one that will have trapped the poet, with him unable to hear beyond it. The effect on the reader is significant too. Once more, emotional turbulence is created by the inclusion of the image of a child. Nicholson's choice to include the image of himself as a child, or the images of children more widely throughout the collection, was perhaps an unconscious nod toward the influence of the ironworks on his own childhood. It should also be noted that several poems mentioned here, The Pot Geranium, Winter by the Ironworks, Weather Ear, and The Buzzer, all use the repeated image of wind to enhance the narrative line. In The Pot Geranium, Nicholson introduces the idea of the trade wind. He writes, "It is the Gulf Stream that rains down the chimney, making the soot spit. It is the trade wind that blows in the draught under the bedroom door." Then, in later poems, a familiar easterly wind appears. In Weather Ear, the poet writes that the wind will be in the east and frost on the nose today. And in The Buzzer, the speaker describes waking at night in winter with a southeast wind coddling the town in smoke and the marsh smell. Finally, in Winter by the Ironworks, the whoosh of the wind carries away the material of the slag banks that the children have been playing amongst. The image of the wind intensifies the coldness and harshness of the winter in Millom in the poems, but also represents movement amidst the static nature of Nicholson's own life. The wind moves through and beyond the town, whereas Nicholson does not. He can only imagine where the wind has come from on its journey, as well as only imagine where it may go next. The wind in the poems also brings with it the presence of the ironworks. They intensify the sound of the industry as well as carry the waste material through the town as if like snow. As such, something naturally occurring, such as the wind, carries a reminder of man's environmental damage, represented by the ironworks themselves. It is a subtle crossover made by Nicholson between man and nature in the collection, a theme which permeates most of his wider work. These themes particularly mirror ideas present in the 1877 poem God's Grandeur by Gerard Manley Hopkins. Nicholson's personal book collection, inventoried after his death in 1987, included a copy of the Poems of Gerard Manley Hopkins, edited with notes by Robert Bridges, published in London by Oxford University Press in 1930. So it is perhaps safe to look for the influence of Hopkins's God's grandeur on Nicholson's work. Hopkins's poem refers to man's negative influence upon the earth, and Hopkins writes, "Generations have trod, all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell." Nicholson makes similar claims across his own work. Man's impact is visceral and tangibly felt by the personified landscape. The pot geranium is perhaps one of Nicholson's best collections, drawing on his isolated geographical location on the edge of Cumberland, or modern-day Cumbria. And it also acknowledges his inability to be parted from the space. It would be hard to imagine Norman Nicholson's Millom without the presence of the ironworks, because his poetry contains numerous references to the site and commentary on its importance in the locality. Nicholson's childhood was littered with touch points between himself and the ironworks, and he observes the creeping influence of heavy industry on the landscape, whether through the site itself or the waste product encroaching on the borders of the town. Nicholson feels anchored by the various sites of Millom, including the ironworks, his home in St George's Terrace and the Hill of Black Combe to the north of the town. He centres himself on the town despite his ambivalence toward the presence of the ironworks, and the site arguably becomes the centre of the poet's world itself, because the constant collision with his daily life is a reoccurrence throughout his work. The ironworks are truly hard to ignore, and so Nicholson has subsumed them into his vision of his hometown of Millom, and the reader begins to understand that it is difficult to write about Millom and the surrounding area without reference to this heavy industry. In short, Millom does not exist in the way Nicholson knows it without the presence of the ironworks, though he indicates that there may be a time where it must do so. I would argue that the entire collection is prophetic, displaying Nicholson's personal concerns for society's environmental future, predicated on his more immediate concern for the rock that lies below his home in Cumberland, from which he acknowledges man comes. The poet suggests that man needlessly damages the landscape. This is a theme that imbues a number of his other collections, including Rock Face from 1948 and Sea to the West from 1981 in particular. He hints at a time where society falls because of the loss of the industry it is so hinged upon, and the subsequent permanent damage to the landscape, but also offers the starting point for thoughts and concerns over the state of the environment as we find it today in 2022. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was wonderful. We're actually going to have a Q&A shortly, but just while Laura is unsharing her slides, we've actually got another speaker who's going to come in and say a few words who we'll introduce in a moment. Just before we do that, a quick apology from me, because I understand from background emails that some of the attendees had problems with link for joining tonight. This is no doubt an error on my part somewhere along the line, so many apologies for that, and just to reassure you that the talk was recorded from the outset and will be available on demand in a couple of days. So if you missed the beginning part of Laura's talk, you'll be able to catch up on it then. But yeah, please accept my apologies for whatever I did along the line, which got the wrong link shared to some of our participants. But thank you for joining us afterwards. That's been great to see people popping in. So let me just do a second very brief introduction. So before we move on to the Q&A, we wanted to actually use this talk on Nicholson to introduce a new and really important piece of work that's been done on Nicholson, which has resulted in the Norman Nicholson Trails app. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce Charlie Lambert from the Norman Nicholson Society, and he's going to take the stage, as it were, and tell us a little bit about the app. So I'm just going to check in with you. Are you okay there, Charlie?
I am.
Share your slides, and then we'll I'll hand over to you. for a few moments, but do be piling up questions for Laura, because once Charlie has introduced the app, we're going to have a little bit of a Q&A from the audience, and you can ask questions to Laura about the main talk of the evening, but equally if you want to ask anything of Charlie, that is absolutely fine too. So we're just going to start sharing some slides, which are coming up in a moment, and there we go. Okay, so I'll just disappear and hand you over to Charlie Lambert. Thank you, Charlie.
Penny, thank you very much indeed, and thanks to everybody for joining us, and a big thank you also to Laura for that excellent talk on the pot geranium. And Laura talked there about quite a lot of Nicholson locations, and the great thing is that we can go to Millom now if we don't live in the town already and explore those self-same locations. We can see exactly where Nicholson's house was, how close it was to the ironworks, how close it was to the slag bank. You can walk across the slag bank and see what remains there. And so just over a year ago, the Nicholson Society, in collaboration with Norman Nicholson House, launched the Norman Nicholson Trails app. Now, at the moment, there are 2 trails on the app. There will be more to come. There's another one just under development at the moment. This came about with big thanks to the Millom Towns Fund, which provided the finance that enabled us to produce this. So in just over a year, despite COVID, we've already had over 300 downloads, good feedback. It also inspired an excellent YouTube video, which I think Penny might remember. So if you would like to explore the app, please do so. So when you do go onto the app, you'll see that opening page, which I showed you just before. There's a welcome there, an audio welcome from Lord Melvyn Bragg, who is the president of the Nicholson Society, and of course a very famous Cumbrian writer in his own right. And there are 2 trails available to you right now. The one we're looking at the moment is the Town Trail, which is about 1.5 miles, and it takes an hour or so with a few stops along the way, starting from the Heritage and Arts Centre, which is right by the train station in Millom. And that takes you around some of the key locations in the town itself, obviously very well known to Norman, including his own house, the Market Square, the library, the park, St George's Church. And these are just a couple of the locations that you will pass en route. This is number 14, St George's Terrace. This is Norman's own house. And as I think many, if not all, the people joining this talk this evening will know, there is a project underway to raise the funding to buy the house and to turn it into a Nicholson museum, as well as a place that will make a really substantial contribution to the town of Millom itself. And right up at the top there, that dormer window, that is Nicholson's own attic bedroom, where he wrote the pot geranium, which Laura was talking about before. And it is a wonderful feeling, actually, to walk into that bedroom, which hasn't changed very much since Norman's day. And you can actually listen to audio of Norman reading his own poem. Unfortunately, the house is not generally open to the public at the moment, but we do have open days from time to time. And this is the interior of St George's Church, very familiar to Norman himself. This is a window which was designed and constructed by the stained glass artist Christine Boyce as a tribute to Norman after his death. And this was unveiled around the year 2000, I think it was, and it's a wonderful piece of work. You can see a detail here on the right. I think the photograph was taken by one Penny Bradshaw with some of the lines from one of Nicholson's best known poems. That's From Sea to the West. But it is an absolutely remarkable piece of work. And when the church is open, you can wander in, have a good look around, and just sit there and drink it in. It is absolutely terrific. Slightly longer walk is the Norman Nicholson Heritage Trail. This is 6.5 miles, so you need to be committed to this one. Take you a couple of hours, but that takes you from the town centre out to the site of the ironworks itself, then around the sea wall, so you get great views of the Hodbarrow Lagoon with developments there into what it is today, with all sorts of recreation going on. It is, of course, beneath that lagoon where the mines were and where mining accidents took place, tragedies took place, and much of the prosperity of the town came from that very location. So that'll take you off on a good walk where, among other things, you will see this. This is the site of the slag bank with this massive lump of unblastable slag that was left behind when they dismantled the ironworks, still there today. And also terrific views on this particular trail. That's looking up the Duddon estuary towards the Lake District fells. And a bit further round, you'll get great views of the Irish Sea as well. So it's a terrific walk on its own right, regardless of all the Nicholson locations which you'll come across en route. So as well as the walk, when you download the trails, you also get historic photographs to give you a real sense of perspective as to where you are in terms of the development of the town, and of course linking to Nicholson's own connections himself. You'll learn quite a bit about the heritage of Millom, where it came from, why it's where it is, some of the references that Laura made to the importance of the ironworks and what happened after the ironworks closed in 1968. You can also tap into some audio memories of long-time Millom residents talking about their memories of what the town was like during the heyday of the ironworks, and even the heyday of Millom Pier, when Millom had a really bustling harbour with ships coming and going all the time. And you can hear Norman reading his poems in the places that inspired him. As I mentioned at the start, there are more trails to come, and this is a picture of our own committee member, Sue Dawson, who lives in Millom, working with children from Haverig Primary School. This was only taken a couple of weeks ago because the Haverig pupils are helping us to design our next trail, which will be in the Haverig area. And that should be available to download in the not too distant future. But it's fantastic to have this input from the kids from the school. Of course, they're learning quite a lot, and we're learning quite a bit from them too. So how to download the app? Well, if you've got an Android phone, you go to Google Play, just search for Norman Nicholson's Millom, and it should come up. With the iPhone users, go to the App Store. Again, same search. If it doesn't appear straight away, search for an app called Situate, and then download that. And once you've got that, you should be able to scroll down the various trails on the Situate app and find the Nicholson Trails app. So if you do go walking, I'm sure it'll keep dry. Can't guarantee a lack of wind though. Please do send us a review. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charlie. That's wonderful. Good to see my pictures popping up there in dispatches. Yeah, absolutely wonderful. And just before we go to the Q&A, just really to second Charlie's comments there, as someone who's just visited Millom with a group of students on a field trip. My MA students went there on a wonderful day led by the Norman Nicholson Society, and the kind of feedback they've been giving about the importance of being there in the place, you know, reading the poetry in those landscapes, really does point to the impact of that on our engagement with Nicholson's work, but also our engagement with the landscape and with the place. And that window, that wonderful window in St George's Church, as one of my students has recently said, you know, you do have to really see it. It is very different seeing it kind of in real life, as it were, the light coming through it. It's quite a dramatic effect, and the words coming through the glass. It's absolutely beautiful. So thank you very much for that, Charlie. And either Charlie or I will be very happy to take questions on how to access the app if you kind of leave here and forgotten some of that. You're very welcome to email me. And I'll put you in touch with Charlie or get you the details. So let us move on now to our Q&A, which is predominantly going to be to do with our main speaker of the day and our main lecture, which was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Laura. That was absolutely fascinating. I've got a student currently frantically finishing her dissertation on Nicholson. And I've got other students who are wanting to work on Nicholson, so I'm really thrilled by the kind of level of new scholarship that's coming through on his work, and particularly in relation to environmental issues. It's just so interesting how he speaks to us at the moment in that way. So that was absolutely wonderful. So in terms of questions, if the audience have any questions, it's entirely up to you. You can either pop a question into the chat. So if you're not used to Teams, you will see a little menu of options that include things like camera and mic, and within those there is a bubble that says chat, so you can type a question in there. I'm going to field the chat menu, so if any comments come through on there, I can read them out to Laura. If you're happy though to ask a question, you can just unmute, turn your camera on, and we'll take questions that way. So let's just give everyone a moment and we'll see if some questions start to come through. I'll keep an eye on cameras coming on or comments in the chat. So I think we've got Jack coming through. Hi, Jack. Good to see you. Would you like to put a question to Laura?
Yeah. Thanks for that, Laura. One comment and one question. I think in general, it was a great paper. The bit about the being willfully confined, I really agree with. And in some of my research, when I'm talking about his connections with other places, all of the time it's still taking it back to Millom. And a word that occurred to me during your talk was ambiguity and ambivalence, because it's the same with the ironworks. He recognizes that it's necessary for the town and appreciates that, but also feels this sense of unease about it. And part of me wondered whether that was insecurity on his behalf as well, the fact that he had no direct connection to something that was so important for the rest of the town. And I suppose I wanted to ask you how you deal with, because I've always found this difficult when a writer talks about their own sense of understanding of a place or certain ideas, and you kind of think, well, actually, no, you say something completely opposite in a different place. How do you deal with that? I'm thinking about the fact that he describes himself properly as a Millom boy, as you said in Wednesday Early Closing, and then in other parts clearly identifies with very different parts of Cumbria. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. I think it's actually quite nice to read someone who is obviously so dedicated to the space that they're from, because I know, we'll all probably feel it on some level that, you live in a space, but you don't necessarily see how fantastic it is. And, especially those of us who live in Cumbria, I'm born and raised here, and I know it's beautiful, don't get me wrong, but it's still kind of cool to think that actually thousands of people come on holiday to where I live type thing because they find it beautiful, but it's not necessarily something we see every day. Ourselves just going about our daily lives, because it is at the fabric of our daily life. So it's quite nice to have that poet who can recognize that, and actually that is his entire focus, instead of sort of taking in the parts from other people and what other people say about the area. And I think it's quite nice as well that his representations of Cumbria do differ wildly from the ones that we do know from the sort of Wordsworth and his friends up in Grasmere, Ambleside and the surrounding area. I think it's really nice to demonstrate that, yes, Cumbria is utterly beautiful, and that does, that includes the Millom area as well, but there are different types of beauty. And I think finding the beauty in the industry is particularly poignant because it's a massive part of our history as well. So, sometimes I feel he really does try to just sort of champion that space, and that's a really sort of special focus in his work, because, it's kind of western and southern Cumbria is a very different landscape from indeed the middle and from indeed eastern Cumbria, where I'm from. So it's quite nice to see that sort of championing in his work. Does that answer your question somewhat?
Yeah, I think I'm also intrigued to hear about. I mean, I've got a quote here where he basically says the men of the town, to a large extent, come from the same stock of the men of the Dales, and it feels like he's constantly trying to compete with this idea that perhaps we get from Wordsworth of the landscape in the Central Dales and the people that live there, and he feels like he's trying to put Millom on a level playing field, but at the same time thereby revealing how much he does appreciate the wider landscape, and that he's not as circumscribed as he says he is.
Yeah, I think you can definitely see an awareness in his writing of certainly writing from other parts of Cumbria, and Wordsworth is an obvious sort of inclusion there, but also of his sort of awareness of writing of other people across the British Isles. You know, there's some very sort of key links in there with Ted Hughes and his writing, sort of Remains of Elmet, etc. And there's other sort of things, you know, I mentioned Gerard Manley Hopkins, but just in sort of in general, that sort of idea of writing about the immediate landscape rather than sort of far-fetched or even imaginary places is something that you can map in quite a few maybe contemporaries of his, certainly. And his book list that I mentioned that was inventoried after he died has a spectacular list of poets, so varied. But you know, if you look into exactly who he was reading and what he was reading, what of their writing he was sort of exposed to, it is, you know, you can see the connections, you can see where his sort of focus has come from his immediate landscape, but also, you know, inspiration from others, and indeed they took inspiration from him. I know Ted Hughes was quite a big fan and sent Nicholson work, so yeah, no, it's great to see, actually.
Thank you, Jack. That's great. And I know that you, Laura, are doing a talk later on this year, perhaps looking at the links with Nicholson and Hughes, which will be very interesting. And I was just thinking when you were talking there that in some ways what you're describing seems to link quite interestingly with Terry Gifford's idea of the post-pastoral. So you've got the sort of pastoral model that, you know, celebrates the rural in quite a sort of naive and straightforward way, and then you've got the anti-pastoral, which kind of goes completely the other way. It's all very realist. But then he posits this sort of third idea of the post-pastoral, where there's a kind of an awareness of those other elements, you know, the industrial in the case of Nicholson, for example, but nonetheless the poetry seems to sort of reaffirm the very powerful connection between the humans and the natural material environment. And I think in some ways Nicholson kind of fits quite well with that in terms of what you're talking about, because there is also that very powerful, very strong bond and affirmation of the importance of that landscape on the individuals living there within Nicholson's writing, which is really interesting. I have got a quick question, but I'm just going to see if we've got any other questions coming through from the audience. So I'm just going to throw that out there again, because I know with Teams sometimes people don't want to unmute until the very moment when we're going to ask a question. So can I just see if any other questions are coming through from the audience?
I've got one.
Yeah, please go ahead, Charlie.
Okay, right. Well, just something that occurred to me actually, Laura, just listening to your presentation, and you highlighted one of Norman's quotes. I thought of myself as a Millom boy, not as a Cumbrian. And I wondered if that kind of sums up both a strength and a weakness of this identification of locality. I mean, that perspective of Norman's is something that I've come across when I've been particularly interested in his writing about sport, and his fierce identification with the Millom cricket team, which was so successful in the 1930s. And he thought of himself very much as a Millom person, not a Cumbrian person. And I just wondered if, because our own sense of belonging is so localized, like him in Millom, you in Orton, me in Liverpool, you know, our allegiance is so tightly localized. Does this mean that actually we have little sense of belonging to the wider planet as a whole, and therefore we're less likely to accept our individual responsibility to that planet, which is something which Norman is saying in this collection and others that we should be doing? Yeah,
I mean, for definite, when I first read that quote, it kind of brought forward for me the sort of something that somebody asked me quite a while ago is, you know, do I define myself, am I British or am I English? And I didn't know how to answer because I'd never really thought about it in such terms as that. But I think, yeah, it definitely brings in sort of ideas of how do we relate to the world beyond where we're from. Because I mean, for Nicholson, I think with his saying I'm a Millom boy rather than a Cumbrian. I think that in part was born of the fact that Cumbria didn't exist for some of his life. It was Cumberland and Westmorland. Like, I live in what was Westmorland, and there's people in my village who say, you know, I'm from Westmorland type thing, whereas I'm 1995 baby, so I am solidly Cumbrian in my in my opinion. But obviously it just sort of depends what you've been brought up with. And I think in relation to sort of the climate crisis, almost it can be quite overwhelming to think of things in the bigger picture. So bringing it down to, well, how does it affect my day-to-day life in my parish, in my county, or whatever? I think that's quite an interesting take on it. You know, how is this sort of climate crisis, global warming, all the things that the president of the USA, the prime minister of the UK, etc., are talking about, how does that actually affect me and my small slice of countryside wherever I am? So I think in a way, you know, he deals with things, very universal things in terms of man's relationship with the world, with the natural world, sorry, that is repeated over and over wherever you go. But by zooming it in on sort of his Millom landscape, it's kind of very personal, very intimate. And I think that works well as a mode of reflection for the reader, because it's how does that map onto the anxieties that I might feel in my local area with sort of climate crisis, environmental concerns, etc. Even if they weren't necessarily the terms that Nicholson himself would have used, because it was kind of pre a lot of the global warming, climate crisis terminology that we might use today.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Laura. I was thinking when you were talking there about Seamus Heaney's Nobel laureate lecture, where he talks about the importance of kind of local writing, you know, being inspired by the locality that you know, and he seems to suggest that only really by doing that, by writing about what you know very intimately, can you ever hope to say anything universal. Because it's by talking, because we all have that, we all have our local, we all have our personal, and if you engage with that, then you are then sort of by default engaging with the wider issues that affect us all. That's a really interesting idea. So we may have a question coming through. No, it's just someone's got to go, but thank you for a very interesting talk, and hopes to catch up with you elsewhere. I'll just really quickly ask my question, and then we'll just see if there's any more questions from the audience. It was just picking up on that idea you were talking about from Andrew Gibson, that idea of the collection being very much kind of rooted in sort of looking inwards and looking downwards. And one of the things I'm really interested in is whether you think there is a kind of shift in Nicholson's perspectives, because in some sense there is an element of that in all his kind of earlier collections, and I just wonder if there is a little bit of a shift that occurs in his final collection in Sea to the West, the 1981 collection. It seems to me that in that collection we do get more of an emphasis on imagery of kind of looking beyond, you know, whether it's a comet, whether it's a kite, whether it's, you know, looking out of windows and upwards. And yeah, so I just wondered if you thought that was the case, but also if so, you know, can we explain that? Is there a definite sort of shift in his sort of final vision towards moving beyond?
Yeah, I mean, I know it was quoted somewhere that he wrote that he was trying to turn away from the introspective nature of his first few collections when it got to sort of his later collections later on in life. And I think, you know, it's really telling, particularly the one that you mentioned, the Sea to the West collection. I think if you just look at the titles of the collection that I use, the pot geranium, and then the Sea to the West collection, the pot geranium, it's very much that sort of lone plant. It's probably inside, it's, you know, it's probably just on a shelf and it sits there and it grows there and that's it. But then Sea to the West, by sort of the very nature of that title, you are looking outwards, but you are looking outwards on something that's completely unspecific as well. Sea to the West, there is no end. There's no suggestion that there is actually land once you know go so far. It's just he's looking out at this vast expanse of sea. So it's that kind of, whilst it is maybe more extrovert in terms of how it looks beyond that sort of really tight Millom landscape, I think it's also quite destabilizing, that kind of almost desperation and overwhelming of so much is going on, because obviously this will be like post-wind scale disaster, all the things that are going on with that sort of climate change and eco-poetics and stuff, all eco-critical theory is all sort of coming into the fore as well. So I think it's that kind of realization that heavy industry is out. How do we look after the planet, and when are we actually going to feel the effects of this? And this might feel quite overwhelming for someone, certainly someone like Nicholson, who's lived his whole life in one space. So I think while Sea to the West does sort of maybe demonstrate an outward looking view, which is significantly different from his earlier collections, I think it also hints at a sense of being overwhelmed and being quite anxious about what's to come. And Of course, this was in his later life as well, so that sort of brings with it a whole different sense of emotions and sense of kind of what's next and so on and so forth. So I think, yeah, it's really interesting to read sort of his earlier work and then read his later work. If you just skip from sort of Five Rivers through to Sea to the West without any of the middle bit, and see how different his writing is. It is fascinating stuff.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Laura. You know, both in terms of where the contexts were in terms of, you know, history and what was happening at that moment, but also in terms of his age and how that changes his perspectives. And I think that's a really, really interesting reading of that. So it is a projecting outwards, but there's a kind of an anxiety with it because there's an uncertainty in terms of what is being projected towards. Yeah, really interesting. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to check and see if there are any final questions from our audience. Anyone else wants to ask anything? Okay, great. So we're actually just up to time, which is perfect. So just a huge thank you from me to Charlie for introducing the app, which I really hope that everyone here will download and go to. Oh, hang on, we've got a question come through. Hang on, it's quite a long question. Just a second, bear with me. So it's in the chat. I'll just read it out. Hang on. At the end of it, it says, sorry, it's a wall of text. So hang on, bear with me a second here, Laura. So Nicholson, the journalist, seems to regard the ironworks somewhat differently from Nicholson, the poet. There's a quote: Millom ironworks, a magnificent, heart-stirring sight, a human climax, a human signature on a land where otherwise man seemed to have little claim. If I wanted any explanation for the ironworks, I had not to go to the fells across. Sorry, I'm just scrolling up across the estuary, but to the ground beneath me. This is the rock that feeds the roots of the furnaces. This is the compost out of which Millom nurtures and folds its great green rhubarb leaves of roof and gables. That's a quote from Nicholson, Nicholson's Millom delivered 1952. And the question is, do we ever see Nicholson confront the extremity of his responses to the ironworks, magnificent and heart-stirring as above, or alienating and ominous as in Laura's presentation? Okay, so those two, right. Okay, I'm going to throw that over to you, Laura. It's quite a challenging question.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the question. So I think it's particularly interesting that his poetry, from sort of my reading of it, has been not necessarily anti-ironworks, but not necessarily championing the sort of human man-made industry that it is. But, you know, I think that quote that you've picked up on, sort of magnificent in terms of just the size of it, the sort of implications of it on the landscape, because that particular bit of the landscape as well is particularly flat. So it's always going to sort of look quite big in comparison to everything that's around it. I think he once described it as some sort of ship on the Duddon estuary. There's quite a good quote about that. I can't remember the exact words. But I think it's interesting that he writes, you know, human signature on a land where otherwise man seemed to have little claim. It's almost like man has to make his claim on that land. It's kind of, we can't just leave that to nature. And I think that's quite an interesting way of writing it. But you know, I haven't necessarily come across a reading that sort of engenders that confrontation of the extremity of responses, as you mentioned. But I guess it's all in the reading of it, I suppose, isn't it, in a way? Because, you know, you could read what he read in what he wrote in Millom delivered as magnificent in terms of just huge, heart stirring. That doesn't necessarily mean something that's kind of warm and welcoming. It could be something that's kind of more anger or fear or something to that extent. So I think, you know, I think it matters what kind of reading you're doing of it, but also what was going on in Nicholson's life at the time. I know he had family members who worked there. I think one, maybe two, sadly died in accidents there as well. I think it's in Wednesday Early Closing that his only sort of tangible link to the ironworks when he was younger was that his father was working there and sprained his ankle and came home. They brought him home in the ironworks car, and he put his ankle on ice essentially, and that was kind of, the ironworks became the place where my father had sprained his ankle. So I think it's, yeah, his relationship is quite a mixed one. And it would be interesting if, you know, if we could sort of see within some of his writing that sort of mixture. But again, I suppose it depends on your reading, but I've sort of always read his work as very much ambivalent toward the presence of the ironworks, certainly. And you know, like it's been said, you know, he didn't actually work there. He didn't necessarily set foot in the place that we know of anyway. So it's kind of difficult to draw a warmer view of it in that sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? It relates to other sort of themes and topics that Nicholson touches on, where you might get, you know, a sort of version or a particular account in his journalism, or indeed in his other kinds of prose writings, and then he seems to deal with the themes slightly differently in his poetry. So I suppose that, you know, the context in that sense, the literary context, the audience, the sort of wider agenda of what he's writing for at that particular moment also has an impact on his engagement with a particular theme, and that's just a really interesting one. Okay, wonderful, thank you so much. And we're getting some lovely comments through on the chat, just lots of thank yous and connections, and thank you for the connection with Gerald Manley Hopkins is coming through, and yeah, just some lovely feedback. So from me, a huge thank you to Laura for contributing so wonderfully to our Cultural Landscapes series. I'll be advertising our June event very soon, which is Anna Burton, who's going to be talking about trees in literature. So if you don't already follow us and you're not already on our mailing list, if you just email me at penelope.bradshaw@cumbria.ac.uk. You can just Google me on the University of Cumbria website. If you forget that, just look up Penny Bradshaw and you'll find my email, and I can add you to our mailing list. But thank you everyone for joining us, for the lovely questions, and thank you most of all to Laura for a really fascinating talk. And from us, please accept our very best wishes for the last stages of your PhD. Good luck. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Laura. Good evening, everyone.